I started off by doing before the concussion. I did a thesis on whether concussions in rugby can be prevented, or what's preventing them. And you had the likes of people testing out scrum caps, which I found that players who wear scrum caps are more likely to get a concussion because they think they're being saved by the headgear. So their temperament gets higher. So when they're going into tackles, they're just flying in because they think they're protected by the headgear. So that was one interesting thing I found. And then obviously with, obviously trying to find a prevention, I used 3 of the interviews from the documentary, which was one with Tom Owens, who was a PhD research student. And, same as Adam Hughes, who retired through concussions as well. And I believe it was, I forgot who the other one was. My memory's gone. But they all said, there's no prevention whatsoever. And the biggest worry was for Tom, who the PhD research student was. Through his research, the biggest thing for him was the accelerated brain injuries as you grew older. So when they're doing research now, you're only going to see that in the next 20 years, really, the results from it, because they're testing older players now. So whenever a rugby player retires, you'll see it quite a lot now, that they're actually donating their brains now to these scientific labs, so they can be looked at, see if there's any scars on them, so they can be used for future research. So, that was one of my biggest things from the World Cup, really, was trying to get to the bottom of it. I tried my best, but as I said, there is no prevention, unfortunately.
I think the interesting thing with rugby is, as rugby fans, we like the fact that it's a contact sport. That's what a lot of people watch it for. And I think you want to get the balance right between a contact sport, but also the safety. And I'm very interested in children who begin to start rugby. When should you start the contact? When should that start? And I think that's an interesting debate to have, because you want children to learn the technique of tackling, to tackle properly, cheek to cheek and all that kind of thing, because that's so important. And, I think the big issue, I'm going to be having Stuart Corse on later, who'll be able to talk a bit about his playing experiences. But I think one of the big issues is the lack of education on it. And only in the past 5 years I don't know how long a HIA assessment's been around, but I wouldn't say it's been around longer than 5 or 6 years. And there were so many games that I would see where a player would obviously be knocked out, and the medical team would come on and he'd hold up 5 fingers, and you'd assume he's saying, how many fingers am I holding up? And even if he gets it wrong, he's still staying on the pitch, which is just madness. And I think slowly people beginning to understand it. Can you explain a little bit about what exactly a concussion is? What did you find out from the PhD students, to anyone who doesn't understand what actually happens when you get a concussion?
Well, it's basically when, something hits it can even hit the body. You can have a tackle in the body and the brain shakes, and, it'll shake against the skull. And, as we just said then, it was either holding up your fingers, see whether you're knocked out or not, or, I think Phil Steele said to me in one of the interviews that it was the cold sponge, the cold sponge on the head, and it's crazy how rugby sort of, scientifically only done that over the last 5 years, with the HIA. So yeah, it's when you get hit, and these hits are turning into car crash hits now. They're the same speed as a car crash. So, when somebody hits you is when the brain sort of jiggles around in your head. And, it's very dangerous, isn't it? I don't know if you've had a concussion in your life, because, I could have a concussion walking out of the door now. Do you know what I mean? Falling over. So it's crazy that, I'm quite scared, really, that we could get to a point where it could become a non-contact sport if it does get worse, because players are getting bigger. And, we could end up in a position where the NFL ended up with all the court cases and all that, which is quite worrying.
And also the NFL, they use all the protective equipment and rugby doesn't. And I think it's really interesting that, like you say about like what Phil Steele said about the cold sponge. And I think there is that mentality in rugby that it's a tough man sport. You hurt, you get up, you keep playing. And I think that is a big issue for a lot of players, and especially players at the top level as well. I remember a couple of years back now, Lee Halfpenny playing for Wales against Italy, went in for a tackle, got his technique all wrong, got a knee to the head, knocked clean out pretty much, but carried on playing. And I thought, how can this guy carry on playing? And I've read many autobiographies of players speaking about concussion and saying that they got up and they didn't know which way to go or things like that. And it's not just those short-term effects, it's those long-term effects as well. Can you talk a little bit about those long-term effects that can happen to players who have had concussion?
Well, as I just said, they're looking at older players' brains now. And I remember watching a documentary a few years ago of a former Scottish international. And I think John Beattie was interviewing him. And John Beattie was sort of positioned behind the cameras on the former Scottish international. And he's talking as we are now. And he's just sort of stopped mid-sentence and just looked outside his window. And John Beattie's going, what are you looking at? And he went, oh, the garden gate's open. And he said that's what happens with progressive concussions or repetitive concussions, is that, you can just fade in and out of conversation. And the same with Rupert Moon. When I did my Rupert Moon interview, he must be getting on in his 50s now. And, he said he prided himself on the amount of concussions that he had. He, as a scrum half, I think, as he said, he was one of the first scrum halves to wear a commercialised scrum cap, I think. And he said he did it for the money and not for the protection. So, that's how rugby, back in the days of the 90s, money was everything. Whereas now is all about the protection of the players. And again, with the HIAs, Adam Hughes, who if you watch the documentary, had to retire through repetitive concussions after, I think he told me he tackled Josh Navidi, and Josh Navidi, as you said, with Lee Halfpenny, the knee went up into the head. And he said, if you're going to go off for a HIA, why are you even contemplating coming on? Because there's something obviously wrong for you to go off in the first place. And, I've seen many things, many experts say, is HIA, is the 10 minutes long enough? And from talking to Shane Williams, he said, because Shane Williams brought out his own concussion documentary in February, I think. And he said, it's really intense. And, it's almost like, it's almost so pivotal to get that player back on the field that is, they're not thinking about the implications afterwards. And if you look with George North, where I personally think where all this started in 2015, when he had those 2 concussions against England, those 2 concussions, from that point on, it was almost like a microscope on it. And he's obviously had further concussions since then. And you sort of look back and you think, well, to date, I think that was one of his first concussion that I've seen him have in an international game in 2015. And you're sort of thinking, well, he come on twice. He survived the 2 concussions twice in that game. So if he'd got taken off then, would he have had further concussions down the line? Because he would have obviously had 2 or 3 weeks off. So, and that could probably end up in George North having to retire early, which is scary. And, what could happen to him as he gets older? It is really scary, to be honest with you, mate.
And the point you say about George North, I think the big issue for him is what we've noticed, especially over the 2 years. Being at the Ospreys and being an Ospreys fan, it's not easy, obviously. Yeah. But for him, having those concussions, I really think has knocked his confidence. He doesn't get involved in the game as much as he used to. He doesn't go into the contact as much as he used to. I think stats back that up, that when he gets the ball, he tends to pass it a lot more than he used to. The George North of 2013 in the Lions, getting the ball, beating everyone, pushing people off, handing everyone off.
Yeah.
I don't see that anymore. And I do think that is a confidence issue for him. And that is really, really worrying. The fact that you talk about the 10-minute mark for players to come back onto the pitch, that does seem like a really short time, as you say, that, 10 minutes. And as you say, the main aim of a coaching team is to get that player out. Is that the right mindset, do you think? Or do you think that coaches should be like, the last option is to get him back out on the pitch if it's safe to do so. We aren't looking to get him out, or do you think that they've got the time right?
Well, a lot of things that I looked at in my thesis was player contracts. So, I think I looked at the top 10 paid rugby players in World Rugby, and I think Dan Biggar's something like fourth or fifth on the list, and he's on 600 grand a year. So when you buy an asset, and rugby clubs aren't like football clubs, they haven't got the revenue or the money. So, I can see a lot of rugby players going down the hole, after this lockdown, because a lot of rugby clubs, you look at the Gallagher Premiership, they're packing up their grounds every week. So as soon as that's gone, you're losing millions, and that's huge to a rugby club. So when you, for instance, Northampton sign Dan Biggar for 600, get him 600 grand a year, and he gets injured in the first game, is their priority to think, shit, we've paid a shitload of money for this guy. He's our because in rugby, they're marquee signings.
Yeah.
Whereas in football, you can buy 4 or 5 marquee signings. So rugby teams, it's more about getting that one marquee sign in and building the team around them. And that's exactly what Northampton have done. So if Dan Biggar gets injured in that first game, I honestly think that it would probably be in that club's interest, from a club's point of view, to get him back as quickly as possible. Whereas, it should be the other way around. It should be thinking about your asset, and that's what rugby players are, unfortunately, these days. They're assets that, they're almost not treated like human beings anymore. And it's really sad to see. But with the George North thing, as you said there, I've seen a huge difference in the way he's played over the last few years. And it's really sad, as you said, with, when he was on that 2013 Lions and he scored that try from his own half, and you're thinking, the career this boy's going to have. And he still has had a great career. He could possibly still beat Shane Williams' try record for Wales. But, he's almost been soured by these injuries. And, what could Wales have done to prevent these further injuries? What would have been 3 or 4 weeks out of his career to save the next 6 or 7 years?
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, he had a lot of concussions at Northampton. I'm really interested in the fact that you've been a rugby ref, and that you've handed out a lot of yellow cards and red cards over your time. I was just wondering what the understanding of concussion is at grassroots level here in Wales, as an example, because obviously at the professional game, we see a load of medical team run on, the player goes off, he has a HIA, and then the commentator will say, oh, this player's failed the HIA, he's not coming back on, or he's coming back on, and then the other player leaves. At grassroots level, what do you think the understanding is? And if it is not a great understanding, do you think that clubs need to be educated more on it?
Yeah, I certainly think at a grassroots level, from what Ben Whitehouse told me, he still goes to the local, even though he's an international referee, he still goes to the local society meetings that are held in Llandaff. But as I said earlier, if you miss 1 or 2 of them, you're almost falling a mile behind. So you're almost always playing catch up as a referee, especially on the laws. I remembered refereeing a game, and I hadn't been to a few society meetings. So, and the HIA had come in about a year prior to this, and somebody had a head knock, and I sort of didn't really know what to do. So in my head, I thought HIA, 10 minutes, you can go off for 10 minutes. I didn't have a clue at that point, and it's quite bad of me to say that, but I didn't have a clue at that point what a HIA was. But this is just me as a young referee, and I'm sure a lot of referees are out there who are in the same position as me. So he's just gone off for 10 minutes and then come back on. So, I bet up and down the country, you get in situations like that, which is really bad. And when I talked to Tom Owens, the PhD student, I said, if got anything, if there's sort of grassroots players who are suffering concussions, and he said, just stop, take a few weeks out. And that's exactly what it is. And it's the same as what Phil Steele said, because it used to be 3 weeks back in the day. As soon as you had a concussion, the doctor would say 3 weeks. And the Newport coach and the Newport staff were saying to Phil Steele at the time, because he was actually a really good player back in the day, they were saying, don't tell anyone you've got a concussion. We need you back for this pivotal game against Swansea or Cardiff or whatever. Like, I personally think those days are gone, but I think, as I said earlier, at a higher level, when you get these marquee signings, it is almost like they're playing with fire if they're using these players as just sort of symbols for the club.
Mm.
And I remember the France-Wales game from 2018, I believe, and it was the game that went 20 minutes overtime.
Mm.
And I think France went to passive scrums or something like that because the player pretended to have a head knock. And, that was disgusting, I thought. I thought that was... And France should have been duly dealt with, but they weren't. And if World Rugby don't crack down on it sooner rather than later, then, you're going to get not just injuries, but you're going to get deaths on the field.
And we've already seen deaths on the field. There's a young lad in France, I think he's about 19 years old, who died last year. And there's been a couple of other instances. I want to get to some listener questions now. And you just mentioned World Rugby. And one of the questions is, what do you think World Rugby can do to help players be more protected during games with head injuries?
Well, through the documentary, I was almost on my own little journey during the documentary, to be honest. I thought, I knew quite a lot about concussions. I knew a lot about the laws, but in fact, I only knew about that much. So when I've talked to, and this is why I wanted to talk to professionals like Shane Williams, Martin Williams, the highest, Martin Williams, 100 caps, Shane Williams, top try scorer for his country, Phil Steele, who's been in the industry for 26 years. So I wanted to get their perspective and the sort of things that they said was, World Rugby can't really do much more. And as I said earlier, I don't want to get to a point where, tackling's taken away from the game, because that's a huge part in the game. I was watching, over the lockdown, I've been watching old rugby games, and I watched, I think it was Connectley against Leicester Tigers in the European Cup in 2002. And there was no tries in the game. It was just penalty kick after penalty kick after penalty kick. But the biggest roar from the crowd was a huge hit from one of, I think it was Stephen Jones or one of the backs. And you don't want to lose that from the game, so turn people away from the game, I know players who, and it's similar to boxing rugby is, where you can get people off the streets, and I played with some absolute nutcases who, I know if they didn't play rugby, they'd be in prison. So, without these big hits and them being able to take their sort of inner anger from the outside world onto a rugby pitch, is going to turn them away from the sport. So, to answer the question, I don't think World Rugby can do much more. One of the questions I put out in my survey was less defence coaches. And I think Martin Williams laughed at that, because obviously he worked with Sean Edwards, and how great Sean Edwards was for Welsh rugby, probably the best defence coach in the world. And look what he's doing with France now. And I think the no defence coaches is a valid opinion, because you look at rugby league and, if an alien landed on Earth and he showed them a game of rugby league and a rugby union, they'd probably think both sports are the same. But then you'd have one hit in rugby league, which isn't even a yellow card, and then you'd have one hit in rugby union, which is a red card. So, this is what's been brought into rugby union, these sort of, these blitz defences and them coming up in your face even before you have the ball. So that's one thing that possibly could be done. I wouldn't like that, because I think rugby league coaches in rugby add to the game, and it's nice for people from rugby league to come over to our sport. But yeah, to answer the question, there's not much more World Rugby can do, apart from, which has been talked about, lowering the tackle. But then, as we've just talked about, you've said about Lee Halfpenny, knee to the head, Adam Hughes, head to Josh Navidi's knee. The lower you get, maybe the more chance of you getting a concussion.
Exactly. And I think, most concussions do happen when the technique is wrong. And so maybe we need to educate younger players from a very young age. This is how you tackle. This is how you do it. And the problem is now a lot of players try and jackal the ball, don't they? They try and rip the ball out of the tackle, so they go in high. We see lots of teams try and do this. I think Ireland did it very successfully a few years ago against us, and just ripping the ball out. And you have to go high for that. You got to put your head near their shoulder, where you can definitely get a big hit on you. And it's a real concern for players. And as I said before about George North, it seems that players who have had it once maybe are more at risk of having it again and again and again, which is a big
Yeah.
concern. The final question I want to ask you is another listener question, is about tackling at youth level. Do you think that we should make players, as they get older, they can then begin to tackle and keep it at tag level, maybe till about under 14s?
It depends what sort of standpoint you want to look at it from.
Mm.
In New Zealand, they have the sort of rule of whether you're 13, is about your size. So
Mm.
if you're 13, you can play under 18s rugby just because you're bigger. And that's why by the time they get to 18, then they're world class.
Yeah.
So it depends what standpoint we look from. Do you want Welsh rugby to get better? Obviously yes, but then you've got to keep in mind about the safety of the players. I started tackling when I was 9.
Mm.
So, that's quite an eye opener. And, you didn't think about concussions then, and that was only about, 10, 12 years ago. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
So from that standpoint of view, I would always like to follow the New Zealand mold because they're the best in the world at what they do. One thing I was going to say about going back to the last question was the ruck area.
Mm.
And people forget that, during rucks, you have the opportunity when somebody is standing over a ruck to run full pelt at them and smash them to the floor. And I don't think that's been taken into account. I think people are just thinking about, the open wide spaces of, making a tackle and this and that. One thing they could do is maybe, have a 1 meter from the ruck. So not so much like rugby league, but you're allowed one player in a ruck at each time. So maybe if someone gets tackled, the tackler is allowed to get up and jackal for the ball. And then one other player then is allowed to come in. And, people might disagree with that because, what are the consequences if 2 or 3 players get into a ruck? Does the referee give a penalty? What does he do? Does he give a free kick? And it stops starting the game. But, these are the discussions that World Rugby are having, and they've got to be sort of taken into account because, any contact, as I just said, it's not always contact to the head. It can be a contact to the chest and a sort of whiplash effect to the neck that affects your head. So, I think World Rugby's doing all it can. And as I said, to follow the New Zealand mold, I think Wales are trying to do that. And it's, in a way, we're almost always behind New Zealand. So what we started doing is the college rugby. We're trying to get like the Coleg y Cymoedd, Coleg Cigar. And, the quality of rugby there is brilliant. You've seen the likes of Jared Evans, Josh Adams come through that system, which is great to see. But I've always wanted to follow the system of, if you're big enough, you're old enough, and, hopefully then you'll be good enough, just like the New Zealand mold. So from that point of view, youth rugby tackling, I don't think you would take that out of the game because if you stop tackling at that age, what are you going to do when they get to the adult level? Do they have to restart, trying to learn how to tackle again? And, if you haven't tackled for 3 years and you go from youth level to a men's game, then you're going to get hurt because you don't know how to tackle anymore.
Exactly. And what you say about New Zealand is really interesting. And I've known about that for a while, that they do it on size. And what that then means is that it's an equal playing field for everyone. And that ball handling skills get so much better because you don't have your size to back up in. So you can't just shove someone off or run through someone. You have to use your footwork, your ball handling skills, your tactical awareness, and your awareness of what's going on the pitch. And you have to use that a lot more. And what you say about youth rugby, I absolutely agree with you. And I think it simply comes down to teaching children from a very young age the proper tackling technique. And I think that World Rugby trying to lower the tackle height simply isn't going to work because, the best tackler at one point in the world was Dan Lydia, where he could get them round the ankles. And yet he's putting his head in some dangerous places, and so trying to put the tackle down to that level, I would be really worried for players because players are different sizes and everything like that.
And if you think about Dan Lydia, at one point he's probably the best defensive 6 in the world. And Wales needed Dan Lydiate because, you know, they had Dan Lydiate for the low tackle, they had Sam Warburton for the jackling, and then you had Falatau for the ball carrying. So when World Rugby said, you know, they're getting rid of the chop tackle, all of a sudden Dan Lydiate's career dissipates because you know, that's his game. And that's what Warren Gatland needed him for. You know, Warren Gatland brought him back into the Lions fold after not even playing for a season. That's how much they needed him. And he ended up playing in the last test and making a huge impact. And that's one thing that, you know, saddens me is that, you know, we've seen it with players in the past where World Rugby have changed the laws of the game and has affected a person's game. So one, Dan Lydiate, and another one was Adam Jones. So Adam Jones, when they changed the scrummaging laws, you know, his biggest thing was the hit. And every time, you know, if you look back at an old rugby, not even an old rugby match, you look back at a rugby game from, say, 2007, you know, it was get the players into a formation, into a scrum, bang, straight in. And they would always talk about the neck. But that was his biggest thing is getting that hit and then pushing the prop back as soon as the ball was in. But as soon as they changed the laws to, you know, crouch, bind, set, you know, there's no hit there. And again, Adam Jones got taken off after, 40-odd minutes against South Africa, in South Africa. And I think that was his last game for Wales. And it's sad, really, because, as I said, you know, at the start of the programme, you wouldn't get this in any other sport where you're changing the laws constantly every year. So there needs to be a sort of guideline from the World Rugby to say this is universal now. These are the laws, and they're going to stay in place now for the next 4 years because, as you know, with every 4 years there's a new cycle. You know, whether it's coach, I think there was only one coach left after the World Cup. I think it was Eddie Jones. So every 4 years, then after a World Cup is finished, you know, you sort of keep those guidelines and you know, keep them there for the future.
Exactly, that's perfect.